Thanks, Ian. I'm gonna just get our PowerPoint up real quick. All right, I think both Wayne and I are up. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be presenting with everyone and with this group. We're gonna be talking about volunteer engagement through direct action, which kind of seems like a little bit of a lot of scary words. And I think there's a lot of misconception about what direct action actually means. And I think really we're here to dispel some of those myths and give you the tools to do this in your community and find a way that works for you. I'm super excited and grateful to be presenting with Wayne. He'll tell you more about his long activism past, but it's just a pleasure to be presenting with him. As I said, my name is Kristen. I am the Connecticut Insulin for All chapter leader. I've been in this position since 2019 now. I'm also the co-leader of the T1 International's Federal Working Group. And for my day job, I am with the U.S. Federation of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I am their associate director. A lot of my work was in justice, and part of that was occasionally helping bust nuns out of jail when they participated in their own direct action. And I really joined this community as a space to find other people who have also rationed their insulin, but also a way of storytelling and turning some of that pain into action. And I think that's really where the direct action comes in. And I'm going to pass it over to Wayne now.
Hey, thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to T1 International. It's just great to be with you all. My name is Wayne Turner. The photo there is what I looked like 30 years ago, back in 1991, during my days of protesting as part of ACT UP, the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which is a direct action organization, people united in anger and committed to ending the AIDS epidemic. I'm now an attorney. I actually went to law school later in life after my partner had died. And so I'm working now as a senior attorney with an organization called the National Health Law Program, which does not take pharma money, but we're an organization committed to advocacy for healthcare access for low-income and underserved persons. And in that capacity, we had the pleasure of partnering with T1 International in an amicus brief in the Minnesota insulin access law. The Alex Smith law, and had a really great opportunity to work with Nicole and Jesus and other advocates in that space. And then I also work right now as an adjunct law professor. So it's kind of I've had a kind of a unique journey of protest and getting arrested and to now teaching. So I'm really glad to be here and really glad to share this experience, because the direct action and protest is such an important kind of component and strategy as part of a broader advocacy strategy. So really glad to be talking with you all now. And just one last caveat. I'm a lawyer and I'm going to be talking about some legal issues, but I'm not here serving as an attorney or as an attorney to you all. So like a lot of times some of the best advice I could say is seek legal help or ask a lawyer also who specializes in some of these things for some of the protests and direct action that we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so can we go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit, like when we're, I think what we're going to talk about is a pretty broad array. And so we'll start with the idea of civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is pretty specific in terms of what it is. It's about refusing to obey a law. And you're refusing to obey a law to make a broader political point, to influence policy. So think of this as Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus. So she was breaking a law, and the law that she was protesting, of course, was segregation. People can also break the law by occupying buildings or blockading streets or shutting down public transportation. So those are examples of civil disobedience as well. A key component of civil disobedience is civil, right? That it's that there's a commitment to nonviolence and a broader vision of achieving achieving policy change through the breaking of unjust laws and shining the light on unjust laws and policies. So if we could pivot to the next slide, what we're talking about a little bit more broadly during this session is direct action. And so direct action is a much broader concept than civil disobedience. I think civil disobedience kind of falls within that like a subset. It's one of multiple strategies. But direct action is a whole spectrum of activities designed to tell your story, to influence policy, to highlight an injustice. And so it really is a broad spectrum. So when we're talking about direct action, it's not always about protesting and getting arrested and conducting civil disobedience, although it could be. And I mean, this slide has multiple examples of different kinds of direct action. I mean, looking in the lower corner to Mahatma Gandhi, who of course really championed and was the deep thinker on nonviolent civil disobedience. But then also the occupations of the lunch counters when we think about organizing mass protests and marches and demonstrations on everything from Black Lives Matter movement to anti-war and pro-peace protests. Those are all within the spectrum of civil disobedience, as are kind of like more kind of informal or less structured kind of protests. ZAPs. Confronting injustice. We see a photo here of some T1 International advocates protesting at I believe that this was at a shareholders meeting, right? But this is, and we'll talk more about the examples of T1 International and engaging in direct action. So when we think about direct action, it can mean many things, and it takes different forms. I mentioned the amicus brief that my organization, the National Health Law Program, filed in the Minnesota court case with T1 International, and that brief really lifted up the stories and the direct experience of people living with diabetes and the impacts of insulin rationing and the consequences, including the tragedy of Alex Smith and so many others. So I think of that as a form of direct action as well, right? It's speaking your truth, it's speaking up to power, it's shining a light where none had, where there is darkness. So again, with this broad spectrum of direct action, there are some forms of it and some kinds of actions and protests make you more vulnerable to things like arrest. And there are serious consequences and considerations, especially for people with diabetes. I mean, in my own experience working with the HIV/AIDS advocacy movement, I mean, certainly had shared those concerns and those parallels of people who are literally fighting for their lives, but also medically vulnerable, right? And so who can experience severe consequences with arrest and at the hands of police. And then, so I'm going to stop there, and then we can maybe go to the next slide. Or Kristen, do you have anything to add to the kind of broader what is direct action?
I think you covered it. I mean, there's really more than 250 different forms of honored nonviolent direct action. And so I try to tell everyone that you can find one that works for you and works for your situation. I saw a little bit in the chat, and we'll talk about it a little bit later about considerations for people with diabetes and with disabilities, that looks a little bit different. And we also wanted to honor the history that some of us have been a part of as well. And so we have photos from T1 International and their direct actions, because they've been doing it for years. In the top left corner is actually from 2021. That's the most recent. Kaylin from Ohio Insulin for All has been organizing protests outside of Eli Lilly over the summer before COVID kind of resurged in the area. And so she had been holding those, I believe, monthly. And the other pictures, it's the lower left corner, actually both the lower photos are from 2019, which included the arrest of Nicole Smith Holt. as a civil disobedience action. But the rest of us all participated in a vigil in which families who were most deeply affected and lost someone to the insulin pricing crisis were able to speak their voices and share their experiences with everyone. I was able to participate in it, and it was probably one of the most powerful experiences in my life. And then up in the top right corner, I believe was 2018, outside of Eli Lilly, and T1 International and Liz have been doing this for a very long time.
Yeah. Oh, and so there's a pretty an important history of people fighting for their lives with direct action, with protest, and so a lot of my advocacy experience is with ACT UP and HIV/AIDS advocacy. But do want to call out and honor the work and the sacrifice of persons with disabilities. And so the organization Americans with Disabilities for Attendant Programs Today, or ADAPT, was founded in Denver, where people who use wheelchairs surrounded a city bus, demanding access for people with disabilities to public transportation. The images on this slide show the more recent protests when the Republicans were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act and really eviscerate the Medicaid program. And so it was people with disabilities who were at the forefront of the fight to protect the healthcare for millions of people by engaging in protests and marches and acts of civil disobedience, and being dragged out of the Senate office building and occupying congressional offices. So really want to acknowledge that I mean it's not really patient advocacy, it's people advocacy, right? Because we're not just patients, we're people. But speaking the truth and just highlighting the real life implications in this case of repealing the Affordable Care Act and cutting the Medicaid program would have on the community at large, but particularly with people with disabilities. And the whole idea of centering the voices of people with HIV or people with disabilities, that people are their own best advocates. And so I guess, that kind of goes into the AIDS protest movement. So I became involved with ACT UP back in the late 1980s. And so, ACT UP was formed, around I think it was like 1986 or 1987. But it was formed as a direct action protest group of people who were, confronting not only a pandemic in which so many of our brothers and sisters were dying, but government indifference, but also glee. There was this kind of ghoulish celebration among some in this country that continues to this day of the people who were getting sick from AIDS and who were dying from AIDS. And so it was actually even before the AIDS protest movement was launched, even earlier in 1983, a group of people living with AIDS met in Denver, and they formulated a set of principles that are now called the Denver Principles. And I'm going to put the link to those in the chat, because those Denver Principles, again, for in some of like the earliest and darkest days of the AIDS epidemic, people with AIDS got together and agreed that of some guiding principles, that people with HIV and AIDS need to be involved in the decision making for their own health care, that they shouldn't be tokenized, that they are not victims, that they are not patients, that they are people living with HIV and AIDS. And so it was really kind of in some ways different from for people who were living with a disease and dying from the disease, to become the experts, to be active and to be demanding action. And so, of course, there's a very long history of ACT UP, and it was, it was centered in New York, but there are chapters all across the country, and different forms of protest and different forms of direct action. And so, you'll see some of those images painted here, including protests to demand that the definition of AIDS be expanded to include opportunistic infections specific to women. acts of civil disobedience, disruptions and zaps of political protests, of political events. This was something I was involved with back in the 1991, 1992 presidential elections, that a small kind of group of us would just show up at campaign rallies, starting in New Hampshire at the New Hampshire primary, and popping up in different parts of the country, demanding that candidates have a plan to address AIDS. And really, part of the protest movement and part of this is the strategy is because there wasn't a discussion about HIV, that there or if there was a discussion, it was condemnatory or and just fed into stigma. And so the AIDS protest movement was really born from a need for to frame the issues. My partner used to use the term the politics of shame, that it was kind of turning a mirror back on America to show just the kind of the callous indifference that allowed so many people to needlessly die, and to really articulate the policies and clear-cut policies that need to take place in order to address the pandemic. So if we just go back to the previous one, please. Let me just, Kristen, I just wanted to highlight the photo in the lower right-hand corner is from what's called the Ashes Action. So there were actually 2 Ashes actions at the White House of where people with HIV and their family and AIDS and their family members and their surviving partners brought the ashes of people who had died and brought those ashes to the White House and threw them over the White House fence to show, look, we are bringing we were bringing the dead to the door of the White House and demanding national action on AIDS. I was involved in the negotiations on the permitting for the second Ashes action. And there's video of both the first and the second Ashes actions, and the first was met with like a barricade of police horses, and no one got to the White House. I mean, it was really contentious and it was really dangerous for the participants. And so by the time of the second Ashes action, I helped with that organizing process, and this was before I went to law school. But one of the things that we had collectively decided was that the goal of this action was to take the ashes to the White House and to throw them over the White House fence. That we wanted to do that. And so as part of the negotiation with the police, we all agreed that we would scatter the ashes over the White House fence, not lob the urn. So, and that was this is of course pre 9/11, right? But no lobbing of urns, but scattering the ashes. And so that was when you see some of the video of that, it's just really emotional, very powerful, painful to watch, and again, really to help illustrate and highlight, these aren't just like symbolic, kind of, fake tombstones that we're dealing with, that we're dealing with real people in real lives. So also in this kind of political funeral tradition of activism and ACT UP, it actually dates to an artist, David Jonovich, I believe is how to pronounce his last name, but he talked about, when I die, just take my body to the steps of the FDA, right? And so it was in that vein that the Ashes Action was born, and then other political funerals too. So now we can go to the next slide, and we can talk to you about my partner's funeral. My partner, Steve Michael, died from AIDS in 1998, and he insisted, it's like, we have to up the ante. We can't use ashes anymore. We have to take bodies. And so when Steve died, I met with the same Park Police and the Secret Service and the MPD, Metropolitan Police officers that I had met with on so many previous actions that I had helped organize. And I said, look, we want to take Steve and we want to give him his funeral in front of the White House. And I said, we can either do this the nice way or we can do it the nasty way. Now, the nasty way is we're going to show up and hurl his body over the fence. We want to do it the nice way, and his mom is going to be here. So we want to do something dignified. We want to give him the solemn, homegoing that he deserves. And so we held an open casket funeral in front of the White House. And that's these are images of that. And Steve's mother and I marching arm in arm, to honor her son. So I mean, this is an example of direct action, and setting a goal, and having a vision of it, and then being able to pull pieces together. direct action and protest requires so many people. So it's not just the people who are putting their own asses on the line in terms of doing an arrest as part of a formal protest. It is a whole continuum of people who were involved and engaged, participating, who are helping with the outreach, who are helping with the legal support, and who are conducting those negotiations with the police and serving as marshals to make sure that the participants are safe, both from a law enforcement, but also from the horrible people out there who want to see us dead. So this for me, I mean, is like such an enduring and lasting legacy of my participation in this. But and so I just want to point to it as like, look, we're not just, we're not fucking around here, but this is real stuff. These are real issues that we're talking about. And how do we underscore that? And so, I mean, we did that in this way, and in honor of what Steve asked for. And again, the tradition of that has grown up in AIDS activism of kind of bringing this truth to light. All right, I'm gonna go to the next slide. I'll pass it back to Kristen.
So I think one of the really important parts when we're thinking about our own direction is the 5 W's, which you hear everywhere. So we're going to adopt them a little bit. But it comes down to storytelling. We've heard about how to tell your story. And I kind of view this as the continuation of getting your story out there. So you have to know, why are you doing it? What are your demands? So what are you asking for when you're doing this public action? Who are you targeting? That could be very physical in a broad way in that you're showing up at a particular site, or it could be like, who is your audience? Are you reaching out to all of your state senators because they're voting on a particular bill? And then where and when will you be holding it? The most effective actions are when something is timely. So something happens. Obviously, the insulin pricing crisis has been catching the attention due to the work that's been put in for so many years. So that's really paved the way for direct actions to have the most potency. And I want to highlight T1 International's advocacy toolkit right now, because they do a lot of work in identifying what your purpose could be. So there's resources out there. So if you're like, I really want to hold a direct action, but I don't know how to go about it, I think that's a great toolkit. And we have a lot of resources within our community right here.
And can I just chime in? Let's kind of lift up that part of direct action is that you're educating reporters, you're educating policymakers, you're educating the general public or whomever your target audience is. And so that's why having things like fact sheets, by having one pagers that really talk about the issues and talk about the demands, talk about your vision, but then also includes things like data, citations to information that behind every anecdote and every personal story that you're hearing from people on about their experience with insulin rationing, then there are here's the numbers of what that looks like. And so a key component is in terms of being thoughtful and effective and targeted in approaches is, again, providing that information, because part of what you're doing is framing, and part of your objective is either influencing a court or thinking of an issue, or legislators who are considering bills on these issues.
Definitely. I mean, a part of storytelling is combining the really human interest, putting our story front and center, and then we already have the facts that go along with it, which is what makes it really powerful. What I've seen in my time with direct action is that it takes those who are most affected by the story and often disenfranchised reclaim their story. So we think of the narratives that PBMs and pharmaceutical companies have been able to put out there because they have tons of money and tons of access to all the sort of resources that regular human beings don't. We don't have millions to spend on advertisements saying why and point fingers at each other about why the prices are the way they are. So with direct action, we get to say, we're going to make the narrative, we're going to control the media, and we're going to tell you why our story matters. It so often we get co-opted, and I have just seen how powerful it is to be able to, we don't always get the quotes we want necessarily in the newspapers or the sound bits we want, but part of our story will get there that would have never gotten there if we went through historical, normal, quote unquote, mainstream channels. So I'm going to get into a little bit of considerations for people with diabetes. I didn't mention this earlier. I'm a person living with type 1 diabetes. I have been for 15 years, and I have participated in direct actions, both in the civil disobedience way and from the background perspective. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that experience. Obviously, my experience is as a white young adult female. I really want to acknowledge that I come with a lot of privilege, even though I am disabled. So my safety is not the same as a person of color, and mine is not the same as an able-bodied person, white person who goes to a protest. So just acknowledging that there is a continuum, and you really have to know the risks before you go into these events and have a plan before you go to an event. So when I'm at events, I usually have a partner who I say, I am not participating in civil disobedience. I am going to do this, and we are going to stay together. That plan doesn't always work, especially in the bigger protests. We've seen it with Black Lives Matter protests, where people were in peaceful settings and it didn't stay peaceful due to cops' influence. So you can have a plan, but I always recommend having somebody there with you, especially if you're going to be in a large crowd. Writing your phone number, a lawyer's phone number, or your best friend's phone number who you haven't memorized, writing it on your hand. Always, if you have a medic alert, like I don't like wearing medic alerts, but being in a big crowd, that is important to have. And you should have your supplies on you. But I will say, so I have been in situations where I have been jail support, and part of jail support is making sure that people are signed in and have the knowledge of what is going to happen during this event and taking their belongings. So if you brought a backpack of things that you're going to need on the other end, you give it to the jail support and they make sure that it gets to you later. For people with diabetes, that's a problem. So that's why I have decided in the past not to participate in civil disobedience, because I knew it was 97 degrees in Washington, D.C., and the chances of me going low were really, really high. And if I didn't have access to my snacks and my hands are zip tied behind my back, that's going to be a problem. And so I made that choice, but I was able to participate in other ways. And we've seen in the Black Lives Matter protests, I do know that there was a person with diabetes who the police refused to give her backpack until people literally bullied the police on camera saying that she was diabetic. And so this is a concern for people, and I want to acknowledge it. But I do know people with diabetes who have participated in civil disobedience. There's ones that are, like Wayne said, he has worked with permits with the Capitol Police, and those tend to be a little bit more even keeled, a little bit more organized protests. And then there's large mass protests that you can't really plan for what is going to happen. There are plenty of direct action and civil disobedience trainings. I highly recommend going to them, especially in organized events. Usually they'll say you can't participate unless you go to this training. And that's important because a lot of the times they're going to say, make sure you don't have anything that could be misconstrued as a weapon. If you have syringes, that could be confused as drug paraphernalia. And like charges can amount from that. And so having that background knowledge, super important. If we are holding a protest or we're holding, say, a press conference or a vigil, we can invite allies who can put their bodies on the line. So if we have many partners who are able-bodied, and they might want to participate in civil disobedience to continue the narrative, and they can do that on our behalf. We don't have to always be the ones putting our bodies on the line. our bodies have been through enough. We we go through it all the time. We can have other people do it and have it just be as effective. And that goes along with it. You don't need to risk arrest to be effective. Those support roles are just as crucial. Some of the, Wayne already talked a little bit about it. There's people who coordinate the actions and make sure that that gets out to networks. Jail support. So when they get out, making sure that they have access to trauma-informed care if it comes down to that. Water, snacks when they come out. Marshals sometimes will cut off the streets to make sure that, you know, cars don't go into the crowd when they're walking to one area. And then media contacts. Media contacts are super important because a lot of these things you're going to want to invite the media to be there with you, and you are likely going to want to follow up with press releases. There's, you know, sometimes court or trials if people do get arrested, and then keeping up the momentum after and saying, okay, hey, we can bring this person in, talk about their jail experience, or this person who shared their story on a microphone can again share their full story. I didn't realize how effective this truly would be until I participated in my first one. I was like, I don't know, civil disobedience, it seems like being a pain just for being a pain. I know there was a past history that was really important. I was like, I don't know if that's this time. However, when you arrest 70 nuns between the ages of 30 and 90, people don't like when you arrest nuns, even if that was their entire plan throughout the entire thing. Like, nobody likes seeing a 90-year-old in handcuffs, even though that was like the entire thing that they planned. And so that pushed the narrative of what they were fighting for, and that became the forefront and became the news on CBS, Washington Post, Huffington Post. Like, this seemingly small group ended up catching a lot of notice because of that. And I saw this some in the chat. Don't forget the use of technology. Disabled folks have been using technology for ages as a way of activism. I think of Frida Kahlo painting from her bed as a way of activism. Just if we can't get out there, especially honoring that COVID is a real thing right now, Twitter, live tweeting, live streaming, making videos, all of those are very valid expressions of direct action. Phone banks, calling legislators, bird dogging, which is when you kind of go to a legislator session and hound them with questions on this one topic that they probably aren't talking about. Before we go, we just want to leave you with some resources. I can put those in the chat after. We have the advocacy toolkit, the amicus brief that Wayne talked about, Lawyers Guild for legal resources. I know we have a few lawyers in here. Having a lawyer in your back pocket is always helpful when you're planning these things. 198 methods of nonviolent action from the Albert Einstein Institute. I promise you, you can find one that can fit in your schedule and your time and your abilities. And then ACT UP has an amazing civil disobedience index. It's from the early 2000s, but the information is still so valid today. And then Wayne, do you want to share the quote that from the end?
Sure. I think we wanted to finish with this quote from the amazing late Representative John Lewis, who says, do not get lost in the sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Recognize that our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And so again, we have to make noise because if we're silence equals death.
I don't know if we have time for a Q&A, but I can also answer some of these questions in the chat. I'm going to leave that up to T1 International staff and the powers that be. 5 minutes. Okay, great. I saw one question about, can you talk more about how most civil disobedience is planned and the role of the pre-planning and organizing? I think that's a great question. Wayne, do you want to take some of that?
I mean, I can start a little bit. I mean, again, so I mean, Kristen mentioned the importance of having civil disobedience training, and that's really important for anyone who's participating in an action, not just for the people who are planning to get arrested. So again, like if you're talking with a police officer and you happen to and you're like gesturing and you touch them, that potentially is assault. Because so just having some training regarding what the do's and don'ts are is helpful and important. And so an event that's organized and focused and has a potential for civil disobedience or civil disobedience component, really it's an important element. Similarly, having legal support. So, I mean, a protest in Washington, D.C. can be especially challenging because one block or one sidewalk is under the control of the park police, but across the street it's under control of the Metropolitan Police or the Capitol Police. And we have actually 26 different law enforcement authorities in the District of Columbia. Even the zoo has their own police. And so, knowing what the authorities are, and then knowing what the potential charges could be. So occupying a congressional office versus chaining yourself to a desk could up the charges. And so knowing what the potential exposure is. And so, good planning, good discussion, partnering with experienced activists, but it can't be the same people over and over again doing this. It's not about the usual suspects or, oh, it's the same people over and over again doing this. Really bringing in that new blood and rotating in and out. And again, it's not just the one role, it's all the roles together, which are important, not just for direct action or civil disobedience, but a broader advocacy effort. And so like the question to ask yourself is, how do I fit and what can I do? Like, you might be really, really good at doing research online. And so you might be the best person to be like culling through Securities and Exchange Commission filings from pharmaceutical companies to really nail them on the price hike. So everybody has a role, and it's finding like where is your niche and how do we all grow together.
And I think this might be our last question, but I think it's a really important one about how this may differ when we think of countries outside the US. I think having the law support, having a lawyer that you can talk to know what is within your bounds. We know that we are operating from a very privileged setting where we come from the US, we're both white individuals. So it's a lot different for us. And just remembering that support roles and also using technology and simply talking to your legislators in a really concerted way, a concerted effort is also direct action. It does not need to be civil disobedience. And I just want to thank everyone. I love the energy going on in the chat. Thank you, Wayne, for presenting with me.
And thank
Back
you
to y'all.